"You'll never be more than a farm girl playing dress-up," Patricia Mitchell sneered at me across the Thanksgiving table, her diamond-laden fingers clutching her wine glass like a weapon. "David deserves better than someone who brings nothing to this family." 8 years later, when their precious family estate was about to be foreclosed, they walked into my Hartford office begging for help, not knowing I was the anonymous investor who already owned their home and had been collecting their rent for the past 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, though back then I was still Sarah Johnson, the girl from Clearwater, Iowa, population 2,500, where the biggest excitement was the annual corn festival and everyone knew your business before you did. I grew up on Johnson Organic Farm, where my parents, Robert and Linda Johnson, taught me that hard work was the only currency that mattered, and that a person's character was measured by how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. I never imagined that 28 years of my life spent learning to coax life from difficult soil would prepare me for navigating the even more challenging terrain of Connecticut high society. When I met David Mitchell at a renewable energy conference in Chicago, where I was representing our farm's sustainable practices, I thought I'd found someone who shared my values. He was handsome in that effortlessly polished way that spoke of good genes and better grooming, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of spring wheat. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say about sustainable agriculture and community development. David worked for his family's real estate business, Mitchell Realty Group, but he spoke passionately about incorporating environmental considerations into property development. During our whirlwind 6-month courtship, he painted pictures of a future where we'd revolutionize how people thought about sustainable living spaces. He visited the farm twice, charming my parents with his attentiveness and apparent respect for their way of life. My father, usually suspicious of city folk, actually liked David, which I took as a sign that my judgment was sound. The first crack in my fairy tale narrative appeared when David suggested we marry in Connecticut rather than Iowa. "My family has this tradition," he explained, running his fingers through my hair in that way that used to make me forget my own name. "All Mitchell men get married at Willowbrook Manor. It's been that way for 3 generations. When I gently suggested that my family might prefer something closer to home, he assured me we'd have a second celebration in Iowa, something small and intimate just for my relatives. That second celebration never happened. The wedding was beautiful, in the way that only unlimited money can make things beautiful. Willowbrook Manor, the Mitchell family estate, stood like something out of a period drama with its stone walls covered in ivy and gardens that probably cost more to maintain than my father's annual income. The ceremony took place on the sweeping lawn with white chairs arranged in perfect rows and more flowers than I'd seen in my entire life. I felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story, wearing a dress that cost more than my parents' truck and smiling at people whose names I struggled to remember. Patricia Mitchell, my new mother-in-law, had insisted on handling every detail of the wedding planning. When I'd timidly suggested including some of my family's traditions, like the unity candle ceremony that my grandmother had always dreamed of seeing at my wedding, Patricia had smiled with practiced condescension and explained that the Mitchell family had their own customs. "We'll keep things elegant, dear," she'd said, the word dear sounding like an insult wrapped in silk. The reception was held in a tent that probably cost more than my college education, with 5 courses served on china so delicate I was afraid to breathe near it. I watched my parents, uncomfortable in their best clothes, trying to make conversation with people who spoke in abbreviations about places and things they'd never heard of. My father, who had worked with his hands his entire life, kept wiping his palms on his pants before shaking hands with David's relatives, as if he might somehow contaminate them with his honest labor. David's sister, Jessica Mitchell Crawford, spent most of the reception explaining to anyone who would listen how she'd met her husband, Michael, at a charity polo match, as if this somehow made their love story superior to ours. She wore pearls that her mother-in-law had given her, she made sure to mention, and carried a purse that cost more than most people's cars. Every time she looked at me, her expression suggested she was trying to solve a particularly confusing puzzle. "So, Sarah," she'd said during the cocktail hour, her voice carrying that particular pitch that wealthy women seem to perfect in finishing school, "what exactly do your parents do again?" When I explained about the farm, her eyebrows rose to somewhere near her hairline. How quaint! Like a little hobby farm? The dismissal in her tone made my chest tighten, but I'd forced a smile and explained that we fed hundreds of families through our crop shares and farmers market sales. Richard Mitchell, David's father, commanded attention wherever he moved through the party. He had the kind of presence that comes from decades of people deferring to your opinions because of your bank account. When he'd approached me near the end of the evening, I'd hoped for some kind of welcome to the family, some acknowledgement that his son had chosen well. Instead, he'd studied me like a livestock appraiser evaluating a questionable purchase. "David tells me you went to Iowa State," he'd said, managing to make my alma mater sound like a community college. "Did you study agriculture?" When I'd explained my degree in business with a focus on sustainable development, he'd nodded in the way people do when they're not really listening. "Well, I'm sure you'll find plenty to keep you busy here in Connecticut. Patricia knows all the best. Charity organizations if you're looking for ways to spend your time." The assumption that I'd become a decorative wife who dabbled in charity work instead of pursuing my own career should have been my first red flag. But I was still caught up in the romance of it all. David loved me, and that was what mattered. His family would come around once they got to know me better, I told myself. After all, how could they not see what David saw in me? Our honeymoon in Tuscany was like stepping into a dream. David was attentive and romantic, taking photos of me among the olive groves and feeding me bites of gelato in picturesque piazzas. We talked about our future, about the sustainable housing projects we'd developed together, about combining his family's resources with my innovative ideas. For 2 weeks, I let myself believe that the awkwardness with his family had been wedding stress and that our life together would be everything I'd imagined. Reality reasserted itself the moment we returned to Connecticut and moved into the house David had bought for us in Millbrook. It was beautiful in an understated way, with hardwood floors and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. But it was also clearly chosen to fit within a very specific vision of what a young Mitchell wife's home should look like. The neighborhood was full of young professionals who drove expensive cars and wore clothes that screamed, "I shop at places that don't have sales." I'd barely finished unpacking when Patricia called to discuss my integration into the family's social circle. She'd taken the liberty of signing me up for the junior league and had scheduled lunches with the wives of David's friends so I could learn how things work here. When I'd mentioned that I was planning to look for work, there had been a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Work?" she'd repeated, as if I'd announced my intention to take up exotic dancing. "But darling, David provides for you now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And we have so many family obligations that require your attention. The foundation board meetings, the charity galas, the country club committees. You'll be far too busy to consider employment. That evening, I'd brought up the subject with David, expecting his support in pursuing my own career. Instead, he'd looked uncomfortable and suggested we ease into things gradually. His family had certain expectations, he explained, and it would be easier if I established myself socially before jumping into anything too demanding. When I'd pressed him about the sustainable development projects we'd discussed, he'd promised we'd explore those options down the road. The first few months of married life passed in a haze of obligations I hadn't chosen, and events that felt designed to remind me of my outsider status. The junior league meetings were filled with women who discussed interior decorators and vacation homes with the same intensity that my mother's friends reserved for their children's futures. The charity luncheons felt like elaborate performances, where everyone played their designated roles, and my role was clearly David's little wife who's still figuring things out. I tried to fit in. I really did. I bought the right clothes and learned to make small talk about topics that bored me to tears. I smiled at the right moments and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But I could feel myself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter with each passing day. The confident woman who had given presentations to agricultural co-ops and negotiated crop contracts was slowly being replaced by someone I didn't recognize. David seemed oblivious to my growing unhappiness, or perhaps he chose not to see it. He was busier than ever with work, often staying late at the office or attending networking events that I wasn't invited to. When I suggested I might start consulting for local farms interested in sustainable practices, he gently discouraged me, saying it might send the wrong message to his clients. "People expect a certain image from the Mitchell family," he'd said, kissing my forehead like I was a child who'd suggested something cute but impractical. The breaking point came during my first Thanksgiving as a Mitchell. I'd been nervous about the dinner for weeks, wanting desperately to make a good impression after months of feeling like I was failing some test I didn't understand. I'd even asked Patricia if I could contribute something to the meal. Maybe bring my grandmother's famous herb stuffing or the sweet potato casserole that had been a Johnson family tradition for generations. "How thoughtful," Patricia had replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But our chef has been preparing the Mitchell family menu for 15 years. I wouldn't want to confuse the guests with too many competing flavors." She'd paused, then added with false sweetness, "Perhaps you could bring flowers from your little garden, something simple and seasonal." I'd spent hours creating an arrangement from the small garden I'd planted behind our house, hoping to bring some of my own personality to the formal family gathering. The flowers were beautiful, I thought. Autumn branches mixed with chrysanthemums and marigolds in warm orange and gold tones. But when I'd placed them on the entry table as Patricia had suggested, I'd overheard Jessica commenting to her mother about how appropriate that Sarah had brought farm stand flowers to complement the elegant arrangements. The dinner itself was a masterpiece of barely concealed hostility disguised as polite conversation. The dining room at Willowbrook Manor could have seated 20 comfortably, with its mahogany table reflecting the light from a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars. The place settings looked like they belonged in a museum, with enough silverware and glasses to outfit a small restaurant. I'd been seated between Michael Crawford, Jessica's husband, and David's cousin Robert, both of whom spent most of the meal discussing investment opportunities and mutual acquaintances, while occasionally including me with questions that felt more like pop quizzes. "Sarah, what do you think about the proposed development along the waterfront?" Michael had asked, then proceeded to explain why my opinion was wrong before I'd finished expressing it. The conversation meandered through topics I had no knowledge of: the spring regatta season, someone's terrible experience with their contractor in the Hamptons, the social implications of some country club gossip. I'd tried to contribute when I could, but my attempts were usually met with polite smiles and swift subject changes. When I'd mentioned an article I'd read about sustainable housing trends, the table had gone quiet for a moment before Richard had chuckled and said, "How refreshing to have such an idealistic perspective. Youth brings such optimism, doesn't it?" As the evening wore on, the wine flowed more freely, and the comments became less carefully veiled. Jessica had launched into a story about her recent trip to Paris, somehow managing to work in references to the cost of her hotel suite and the famous people she'd encountered. "Of course, Michael insisted we stay at the Georges V," she'd said, glancing meaningfully at David. "One simply cannot compromise on standards when traveling." "Don't you agree, Sarah? Though I suppose growing up in Iowa, you might not have had much opportunity for international travel." I'd felt David's hand tighten on mine under the table, a warning to let it pass. but something in Jessica's tone had sparked a fire in me. "Actually," I'd said, my voice steadier than I felt, "my parents took me to Europe several times when I was younger. We stayed in small family-run hotels and bed and breakfasts. I found them much more authentic than the generic luxury hotels most tourists prefer." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia had set down her wine glass with enough force to make it ring against the china, and Richard had cleared his throat in a way that suggested I'd violated some unspoken protocol. David's grip on my hand had become painful. How very... Jessica had paused, searching for the right word. "Adventurous of your parents. I suppose everyone has different ideas about travel standards." The final blow had come during dessert, when Patricia had been holding court about the family's upcoming plans for Christmas. Apparently, the Mitchells spent every holiday at various family properties, rotating between the Connecticut estate, a house in the Hamptons, and a ski lodge in Vermont. As she'd detailed the elaborate traditions that governed each celebration, I'd realized that my own family hadn't been mentioned once in any of their holiday discussions. "What about visiting Iowa for Christmas?" I'd asked during a lull in the conversation. "I'd love for my parents to meet everyone better, and they've been looking forward to having us home for the holidays." The look that had passed between Patricia and Richard could have frozen the cranberry sauce. "Oh, sweetie," Patricia had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We have such deep traditions around the holidays. The Mitchell family has been celebrating Christmas at Willowbrook for generations. Surely David explained that to you?" When I'd glanced at David for support, he'd been studying his dessert plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Maybe we could do New Year's in Iowa?" he'd suggested weakly, but his mother had waved that away as well. "The New Year's Eve party here is one of our most important social events," she'd explained. "All of David's professional contacts expect to see him there. Missing it would send entirely the wrong message about his priorities." That's when it had started becoming clear to me that in the Mitchell family, I would always be the outsider, looking in, expected to adapt to their traditions while mine were dismissed as irrelevant. But I'd still held hope that Patricia's next words wouldn't cut as deeply as they did. She'd taken a sip of her wine, then fixed me with a stare that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "You know, Sarah," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they're about to deliver what they consider a life lesson. "I've been thinking about your place in this family, and I feel it's important that we're honest with each other." The entire table had gone quiet, even the soft clink of silverware against china stopping as everyone waited for what was clearly going to be a pronouncement of some kind. My heart had started beating faster, some instinct warning me that whatever came next was going to change everything. "David is going to inherit a significant amount of responsibility someday," Patricia had continued, gesturing around the dining room as if to encompass not just the house, but the entire Mitchell legacy. "This family has built something substantial over 3 generations, and it requires someone special to help maintain and protect that legacy." She'd paused to let her words sink in, her eyes never leaving my face. "I'm concerned that you don't quite understand what that means, coming from such a different background. You'll never be more than a farm girl playing dress-up, pretending to be something you're not. David deserves better than someone who brings nothing to this family except a pretty face and naive enthusiasm." The words had hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Around the table, no one had moved or spoken. David had gone pale, but he hadn't said a word in my defense. Jessica had been examining her manicured nails as if they were fascinating works of art. Michael had reached for the wine bottle. Richard had nodded slightly, as if Patricia had finally voiced what everyone had been thinking. "I know you mean, well," Patricia had continued, her voice now taking on an almost gentle quality that somehow made her words even more devastating. "But good intentions aren't enough when it comes to the kind of life David needs to live. You can't fake the kind of breeding and sophistication that's required in our circles." It's not your fault, of course. You simply weren't raised for this kind of life." I'd sat frozen, feeling like I was watching the scene from outside my own body. This woman, who had never worked a day in her life, who had inherited her position through marriage just as I had, was telling me that I was inherently inferior because I'd grown up on a farm instead of an estate. The injustice of it had burned in my throat like acid, but I'd been too shocked to respond. "Perhaps," Patricia had concluded, reaching for her wine glass again, "it would be best if you focused on supporting David's career from the sidelines rather than trying to insert yourself into matters that are beyond your experience. We can help. You understand your role in the family, but only if you're willing to accept that role with grace." That night, lying in bed beside David, who had pretended to be asleep rather than discuss what had happened, I'd stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside me. The farm girl who had been trying so hard to fit into someone else's definition of worth was done apologizing for who she was. Patricia Mitchell thought I brought nothing to the table because she couldn't see past my postal code and my parents' professions. But I knew something she didn't. I knew the value of hard work, real work that created something meaningful. I knew how to build something from nothing, how to take land that others considered worthless and make it productive. I knew how to solve problems and how to persist when things got difficult. Most importantly, I knew that my worth wasn't determined by whether or not Patricia Mitchell approved of me. That realization, painful as it was to reach, would prove to be the foundation of everything that came next. The weeks following that Thanksgiving dinner passed in a strange, numbing fog. I went through the motions of being the perfect Mitchell wife, attending the requisite charity luncheons and social gatherings, but something fundamental had changed inside me. The woman who had once believed that love could bridge any gap between two different worlds now understood that some chasms were too wide to cross, especially when the people on the other side were actively working to make them wider. David seemed oblivious to my growing detachment, or perhaps he simply chose not to see it. He'd throw himself into his work with renewed intensity, staying later at the office and taking more business trips than ever before. When he was home, he treated me with the kind of careful politeness usually reserved for house guests who might leave at any moment. We'd established a routine of parallel lives under the same roof, intersecting only when absolutely necessary, for public appearances. The turning point came 3 months later, during a dinner party Patricia had organized to introduce me to the wives of David's business associates. I'd spent hours preparing for the evening, choosing my outfit carefully from the wardrobe of appropriate clothes I'd slowly assembled, making sure every hair was in place and every accessory met the exacting standards I'd learned were expected of a Mitchell wife. The evening had started predictably enough. I'd stood beside David, shaking hands and making small talk about the weather and weekend plans, playing my designated role as the pretty wife who nodded at the right moments and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But as the night wore on and the wine loosened tongues, the conversation had turned to business, specifically to some properties that Mitchell Realty was struggling to sell. Thomas Bradford, one of David's clients, had been complaining about a development project that had stalled due to environmental concerns. "These tree huggers are killing legitimate business," he'd said, gesturing broadly with his whiskey glass. "They block every project that might disturb a single blade of grass or inconvenience some endangered bird nobody's ever heard of." I'd felt a familiar fire spark in my chest. These were issues I actually knew something about, problems I'd studied and thought about deeply during my college years. Before I could stop myself, I'd found myself speaking up. "Actually," I'd said, my voice cutting through the conversation, "environmental considerations don't have to be roadblocks to development. Some of the most successful projects I've studied have increased their property values substantially by incorporating sustainable design elements and preserving natural features." The room had gone quiet, all eyes turning to me with expressions ranging from surprise to barely concealed annoyance. Thomas had raised an eyebrow, his expression suggesting that he was humoring a child who'd interrupted an adult conversation. "That's an interesting theory," he'd said, his tone making it clear he thought it was anything but. But in the real world, these environmental requirements add costs and delays that make projects financially unfeasible. I'd felt David's warning hand on my back, but the words had kept coming. Not necessarily. I've read case studies where developers have turned environmental challenges into selling points. Preserving mature trees can increase property values by up to 20%. Installing rain gardens and native plantings reduces maintenance costs while attracting buyers who value sustainability. Patricia had appeared at my side as if summoned by some invisible alarm system. "Sarah is still learning about the complexities of our industry," she'd said, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "She has such interesting ideas from her academic background." But Thomas had looked genuinely intrigued despite himself. "Where did you study these case studies?" he'd asked, and I'd found myself launching into a detailed explanation of sustainable development practices I'd learned in my business program, concepts that had been theoretical until that moment, but suddenly felt urgently relevant. For the first time in months, I'd felt like myself again. My mind had felt sharp and engaged, drawing connections between ideas and presenting solutions to problems that clearly frustrated these successful businessmen. I'd talked about green building certifications, tax incentives for environmental compliance, and innovative approaches to community development that balanced profit with responsibility. The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, with several people asking pointed questions about specific projects and implementation strategies. I'd found myself sketching out ideas on cocktail napkins, explaining how to turn environmental requirements from obstacles into opportunities. David had stood beside me looking increasingly uncomfortable as his business associates actually listened to what I had to say. The evening had ended with Thomas Bradford asking if I'd be willing to consult on his stalled project. "Your perspective might be exactly what we need," he'd said, handing me his business card. "Would you be interested in taking a look at our development plans?" I'd accepted the card, feeling a rush of excitement I hadn't experienced since my wedding day. Finally, someone saw value in what I could contribute beyond my ability to look pretty and make appropriate small talk. But my elation had been short-lived. The moment the last guest had left, Patricia had cornered me in the foyer. Her composed facade had cracked slightly, revealing the steel underneath. "What exactly do you think you were doing tonight?" she'd demanded, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "I was contributing to the conversation," I'd replied, still riding the high of intellectual engagement. Thomas seemed genuinely interested in exploring sustainable approaches to his development problems. Patricia's laugh had been cold and bitter. "You embarrassed yourself in this family tonight. These men were being polite, Sarah. They weren't actually interested in your amateur theories about tree-hugging nonsense. You made David look foolish by showing off like some kind of know-it-all college girl." "But Thomas asked me to consult on his project," I'd protested, pulling out his business card as evidence. "And you will not be accepting," Patricia had said flatly. "Mitchell wives do not work in real estate. We do not compete with our husbands' businesses. We support them from the sidelines, through our social connections and charitable work. That is your role in this family." I'd looked around for David, expecting him to defend me, or at least acknowledge that I'd clearly impressed his business associates. Instead, I'd found him standing in the doorway looking like he wanted to disappear into the woodwork. "Patricia's right," he'd said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "It would send the wrong message if you started consulting for my clients. People might think I can't handle my own business." That night, lying in bed beside my husband who'd chosen his family's approval over his wife's potential, I'd made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. If the Mitchell family couldn't see my worth, I'd build my own success, where they couldn't minimize or dismiss it. I'd show them exactly what this farm girl was capable of when she stopped trying to fit into someone else's definition of appropriate behavior. The next morning, I'd called Thomas Bradford from the privacy of my car, parked in a grocery store lot 20 minutes from home. His enthusiasm over the phone had been genuine and infectious. He'd invited me to tour the property that afternoon, explaining that his usual consultants had hit a wall with the environmental compliance issues. The development site was a beautiful piece of land about 40 minutes west of Millbrook, rolling hills dotted with mature oak trees and a creek running along the eastern boundary. Thomas had walked me through the original plans, which called for clearing most of the existing vegetation to create a standard subdivision layout with minimal green space. Standing there among the trees that were slated for removal, I'd felt something click into place in my mind. This wasn't just about environmental compliance or sustainable design principles. This was about seeing potential where others saw obstacles, about finding value that existing approaches had missed entirely. I'd spent hours that afternoon walking the property, taking notes and photos, my mind racing with possibilities. By the time I'd returned home, I had a rough proposal that would preserve the best natural features while actually increasing the development's profitability through higher value lot sales and reduced infrastructure costs. The formal presentation I'd prepared over the next 3 days had been unlike anything I'd done since college. I'd researched comparable projects, run financial projections, and created detailed plans for a development that would work with the land rather than against it. When I'd met with Thomas and his team the following week, presenting my ideas in a conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and possibility, I'd felt more alive than I had in years. The proposal had been a success beyond my wildest expectations. Not only had Thomas accepted my recommendations, but he'd insisted on paying me a consulting fee that was more money than I'd ever earned in my own name. More importantly, he'd asked me to oversee the implementation of the sustainable design elements, effectively giving me my first real job since moving to Connecticut. But my triumph had been short-lived. Somehow, word of my consulting work had reached the Mitchell family circle faster than I'd thought possible. Patricia had called within days of my second site visit, her voice icy with restrained fury. "I hear you've been playing business consultant despite our conversation," she'd said without preamble. "This stops now, Sarah. You're embarrassing the family with this little hobby of yours." "It's not a hobby," I'd replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Thomas Bradford hired me to solve a legitimate business problem, and I solved it. His project is now moving forward because of my recommendations. "Your recommendations," Patricia had repeated mockingly. "You've been married to my son for less than 2 years, and you think you understand real estate better than people who've been in this business for decades. Your arrogance is astounding." That conversation had led to what I privately called the intervention. David, Patricia, and Richard had ambushed me in our living room on a Sunday afternoon, presenting a united front that felt like facing a tribunal. They'd taken turns explaining why my consulting work was inappropriate, embarrassing, and ultimately harmful to David's career prospects. "People are talking," Richard had said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. "They're wondering why David Mitchell's wife needs to work, what that says about his ability to provide for his family." "It's not about the money," I'd protested. "It's about using my education and skills to contribute something meaningful. Your contribution to this family should be supporting David's career and upholding the Mitchell reputation," Patricia had interjected, "not playing at being a businesswoman and making us all look foolish." David had said very little during the confrontation, but his silence had spoken volumes. When I'd looked to him for support, for any indication that he valued my capabilities and aspirations, he'd avoided my gaze and mumbled something about finding a compromise that worked for everyone. But compromise, I'd learned, meant capitulation, in the Mitchell family vocabulary. They'd wanted me to stop working with Thomas Bradford immediately, to apologize for any confusion I'd caused, and to return to my proper role as dutiful wife and social ornament. I'd agreed to their demands that day, sitting in our expensively furnished living room surrounded by people who claimed to love me, but couldn't see past their own narrow definitions of appropriate behavior. But even as I'd nodded and promised to call Thomas to end our professional relationship, I'd been planning my next move. The phone call with Thomas had been one of the most difficult conversations of my life. He'd been disappointed but understanding when I'd explained that family obligations required me to step back from consulting work. He'd paid me in full for the work I'd completed and had even offered to provide references if I ever decided to return to the field. "You have a real gift for this kind of work," he'd said. "Don't let other people convince you otherwise. The industry needs more people who can see beyond traditional approaches." Those words had echoed in my mind during the months that followed, as I'd returned to the mind-numbing routine of charity luncheons and social obligations. But beneath the surface compliance, something had been brewing. I'd started reading real estate publications voraciously, studying market trends and development strategies during the hours David spent at work. I'd researched successful female entrepreneurs, particularly those who'd built businesses in male-dominated industries. Most importantly, I'd begun to understand that the Mitchell family's wealth and connections weren't the only path to success in Connecticut real estate. There were opportunities they couldn't see because they'd never had to look beyond their established networks and traditional approaches. The catalyst for action had come in an unexpected form. My college friend Amy Rodriguez, who'd moved to Hartford to work as an architect, had called one evening to catch up. During our conversation, she'd mentioned working on a project to convert an abandoned textile mill into affordable housing for young professionals. "The developer is this amazing woman," Amy had said. "She specializes in historic renovation projects that everyone else thinks are too risky or complicated. She's making a fortune because she sees potential where other people see problems." That conversation had sparked something in me. I'd driven to Hartford the next day, ostensibly for shopping, but actually to see the mill project Amy had described. The building was a magnificent brick structure from the 1890s, its windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown with weeds. But even in its deteriorated state, I could see the bones of something beautiful underneath. I'd spent the afternoon walking around the neighborhood, noting the nearby university, the young professionals already living in converted lofts, the coffee shops and restaurants that indicated gentrification was beginning to take hold. This was exactly the kind of opportunity the Mitchells would overlook, because it didn't fit their model of prestigious developments in established, wealthy enclaves. That evening, I'd researched the property records online, learning everything I could about the building's history, ownership, and zoning regulations. The mill had been on the market for 2 years with no serious offers, primarily because of concerns about environmental remediation costs and the complexity of historic renovation requirements. But those obstacles looked like opportunities to me. Historic tax credits could offset renovation costs significantly. Environmental cleanup, while expensive up front, would be a selling point for environmentally conscious buyers. The location was perfect for the growing market of young professionals who wanted to live in authentic spaces with character rather than generic suburban developments. Over the following weeks, I developed a comprehensive business plan for acquiring and renovating the mill. I'd researched financing options, renovation costs, and potential rental income. I'd studied successful similar projects in other cities and had even driven to Hartford several times to photograph the building and surrounding neighborhood from different angles. The plan was solid. I knew it was. But I also knew that presenting it to David and his family would result in another intervention, another lecture about appropriate roles and embarrassing behavior. I'd already proven that their support was conditional on my compliance with their narrow vision of what I should be. So instead, I'd made a different choice. Using the money I'd earned from the Bradford consulting project, plus some savings I'd accumulated from wedding gifts, I'd made my first independent move in the Connecticut real estate market. Not by telling anyone in the Mitchell family what I was doing, but by simply doing it. The day I'd signed the papers to purchase the mill had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I'd used my maiden name on all the documents, creating what I'd euphemistically called a little investment project, when David had noticed the bank statements. He'd been so preoccupied with his own work that he hadn't pressed for details, apparently satisfied that I'd finally found an appropriate way to occupy my time with something that didn't threaten his professional image. If only he'd known what this farm girl was actually planning to build. The mill renovation consumed every spare moment I had over the next 18 months, though David remained blissfully unaware of the extent of my involvement. I'd become masterful at scheduling contractor meetings during his business trips and hiding my growing expertise behind vague references to keeping busy with the property. He seemed satisfied as long as I continued to fulfill my social obligations, and appeared appropriately submissive during family gatherings. Working with Amy Rodriguez had been a revelation. Her architectural expertise combined with my business acumen created a partnership that exceeded both our individual capabilities. She understood my vision for preserving the mill's industrial character while creating modern living spaces that would appeal to Hartford's growing population of young professionals. Together, we navigated the labyrinthine world of historic preservation requirements, environmental remediation standards, and city planning regulations. The project had its challenges. The environmental assessment had revealed contamination from decades of textile production, requiring specialized cleanup that had cost significantly more than my initial projections. Several contractors had walked away from bids once they'd seen the scope of structural work needed to bring the building up to code. There had been nights when I'd lain awake running calculations in my head, wondering if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But with each obstacle overcome, my confidence had grown. I'd learned to read architectural plans, to understand load-bearing requirements and HVAC systems, to negotiate with contractors who initially treated me like a wealthy woman, playing at renovation. When they'd realized I knew the difference between engineered wood and solid lumber, when I'd caught errors in their estimates and questioned unnecessary charges, their attitudes had shifted from condescending amusement to grudging respect. The financial aspects of the project had been equally educational. I'd discovered a world of financing options beyond conventional mortgages, historic tax credits, environmental cleanup grants, low-interest loans for sustainable development. Each successful application had felt like a small victory, proof that I could navigate complex systems without the Mitchell family connections I'd been told were essential for success in business. Amy had introduced me to Maria Santos, a real estate attorney who specialized in historic properties. Maria had become not just a professional advisor, but a mentor who understood the unique challenges facing women in real estate development. She'd grown up in Hartford's Puerto Rican community and had built her practice by serving clients who were often overlooked by white-shoe law firms. The establishment doesn't like outsiders who won't stay in their designated lanes, Maria had told me during one of our strategy sessions. They expect us to be grateful for whatever scraps they're willing to throw our way. The secret is building something so successful they can't dismiss it, even if they don't understand how we did it. Her words had resonated deeply, especially when I'd attended Mitchell family events where Patricia continued to introduce me as David's little wife, who was keeping busy with a decorating project. The condescension in her voice had stung less as my confidence in my actual capabilities had grown, but it had also reinforced my determination to keep my real activities hidden until I was ready to reveal the full scope of what I'd accomplished. The mill's transformation had been remarkable to witness. What had started as a deteriorating brick shell had gradually become something magnificent. Exposed brick walls and original timber beams providing industrial character, while modern fixtures and appliances created comfortable living spaces. The units featured soaring ceilings, huge windows that flooded the spaces with natural light, and carefully preserved architectural details that spoke to the building's heritage. Amy had designed common areas that encouraged community interaction, a rooftop garden where residents could grow their own food, a fitness center in what had been the mill's power plant, and a co-working space that reflected Hartford's growing tech startup scene. We'd incorporated sustainable features throughout: energy-efficient heating and cooling systems, solar panels disguised as modern architectural elements, and water collection systems that reduced the building's environmental footprint. The marketing strategy I'd developed had targeted precisely the demographic the Mitchell family's traditional real estate approaches ignored. Young professionals who valued authentic character over generic luxury, who cared about environmental sustainability, who wanted to be part of a community rather than isolated in suburban enclaves. The response had exceeded even my optimistic projections. We'd held a soft opening in the spring, inviting potential tenants to tour the nearly completed units. I'd watched with barely contained excitement as people walked through the spaces, their faces lighting up as they imagined themselves living there. Within 2 weeks, we had a waiting list longer than our available units. The financial success had been equally gratifying. After covering all renovation costs, loan payments, and operating expenses, the mill was generating monthly income that exceeded what many people earned in full-time jobs. More importantly, it had proven the viability of my approach to real estate development, finding overlooked opportunities, solving complex problems, and creating value through innovation rather than relying on established networks. Success with the mill had opened doors to other opportunities. Word had spread through Hartford's real estate and architecture communities about the young woman who'd transformed the abandoned textile mill into one of the city's most desirable residential properties. I'd begun fielding inquiries about consulting on other historic renovation projects, requests that I'd carefully accepted under my maiden name to avoid any connection to the Mitchell family. Within a year of the mill's completion, I'd expanded my portfolio to include 2 other properties: a former brewery that I was converting into artist studios and retail space, and a Victorian mansion that had been subdivided into apartments but retained potential for restoration into high-end condominiums. Each project had built on lessons learned from the previous one, refining my approach and deepening my expertise. I'd also begun developing relationships with private investors who were impressed by my track record and interested in funding larger projects. These weren't the country club connections that David's family relied on, but successful business, people who evaluated opportunities based on potential returns rather than social relationships. They'd judged me on my results, not my pedigree, and had found my work worthy of their trust and money. The irony hadn't been lost on me that I was becoming increasingly successful in the same industry that had been explicitly forbidden to me by the Mitchell family. Every contract signed, every property acquired, every tenant secured had been evidence that their assessment of my capabilities had been wrong. But I'd kept this growing empire hidden, maintaining the facade of the obedient wife whose interests didn't extend beyond charity work and home decoration. David's obliviousness to my activities had been both convenient and revealing. His assumption that I lacked the intelligence or ambition to pursue serious business endeavors had blinded him to obvious signs that my life had dimensions he'd never bothered to explore. Bank statements that showed significant income and investment activity were explained away as inheritance or gifts from my parents. My frequent absences were attributed to shopping or lunch dates with friends. My growing confidence and knowledge about real estate markets were dismissed as casual interest picked up from listening to his work conversations. The facade had required careful maintenance. I'd continued attending family gatherings and social events, playing my assigned role while privately calculating property values and development potential of the buildings we passed. During conversations about David's work, I'd bitten my tongue when he'd dismissed opportunities I knew were valuable, when he'd repeated conventional wisdom that my experience had proven wrong, when he'd made decisions based on status rather than sound business principles. The strain of living this double life had begun affecting our marriage in ways that David had noticed but misinterpreted. I'd become less interested in his stories about office politics and client relationships because I was dealing with more complex challenges in my own work. I'd been distracted during his family's social events because I was mentally solving problems related to my projects. I'd grown less eager to please his parents because their approval no longer seemed relevant to my sense of self-worth. David had attributed my emotional distance to our inability to have children, a subject that had become increasingly fraught between us. Patricia had made her expectations clear through pointed comments about grandchildren and the importance of continuing the Mitchell family line. David had seemed to view my apparent lack of maternal instinct as further evidence that I didn't understand my role in the family structure. But the truth was that I'd deliberately postponed discussions about children until I'd established my business on solid ground. I'd wanted to ensure that any children I had would see their mother as a capable, independent woman rather than someone who'd sacrificed her own dreams for the convenience of others. The Mitchell family's assumption that motherhood would solve whatever restlessness they perceived in me had only strengthened my resolve to succeed on my own terms first. The breaking point had come during David's 30th birthday celebration, held at Willowbrook Manor with all the predictable elements, expensive catering, perfectly coordinated decorations, and guest lists drawn from the same social circle that had dominated every Mitchell family event since my wedding. I dutifully played hostess, making small talk with David's colleagues and friends, while mentally planning renovations for an Art Deco office building I was considering purchasing. Richard Mitchell had given a speech praising his son's contributions to the family business and his bright future as a leader in Connecticut real estate. He'd mentioned David's beautiful wife, gesturing toward me with the kind of proprietary pride usually reserved for displaying valuable possessions. The implication had been clear. David's success was enhanced by his appropriate choice of spouse, someone who reflected well on the family's status and taste. As applause had filled the dining room, I'd felt the familiar mixture of anger and amusement that came from being praised for qualities I didn't possess while my actual accomplishments remained invisible. These people saw me as David's attractive accessory, a woman whose worth was derived entirely from her relationship to a Mitchell man. None of them knew that the quiet wife they were politely acknowledging owned more property in Connecticut than many of them would acquire in their lifetimes. The conversation after dinner had turned to real estate market trends, with several guests expressing concern about increasing competition from non-traditional developers and investors. Someone had complained about projects that prioritized environmental features over maximum profit, calling such approaches feel-good nonsense that appeals to naive buyers who don't understand real value. I'd listened to this discussion with growing irritation as David had nodded along, agreeing that successful real estate required understanding traditional buyer preferences rather than chasing trendy concepts like sustainability and historics. Preservation. When James Crawford, Jessica's husband, had dismissed adaptive reuse projects as money pits that only make sense if you enjoy throwing money away, I'd finally reached my limit. Actually, I'd said, setting down my wine glass with enough force to make several people look up, adaptive reuse can be incredibly profitable when it's done intelligently. Take historic properties, for example. The tax incentives alone can make renovation costs competitive with new construction, and the resulting properties often command premium prices because of their unique character. The conversation had stopped, all attention focused on me with expressions ranging from surprise to mild amusement. Patrick Mitchell had smiled indulgently, clearly preparing to redirect the conversation to more appropriate topics. But I'd continued before anyone could interrupt. I've been following several adaptive reuse projects in Hartford, and the financial returns have been impressive. One textile mill converted to residential units has occupancy rates above 95% and rental premiums that are 30% higher than comparable new construction. David had given me a warning look, but I'd been past caring about maintaining the pretense of ignorance. The key is understanding that different market segments value different things. Young professionals, particularly those working in technology and creative industries, are willing to pay premium prices for authentic spaces with character. They're also more environmentally conscious than previous generations, which makes sustainable features attractive rather than frivolous. James Crawford had raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. You seem remarkably well informed about commercial real estate for someone who's never worked in the industry. Where exactly are you getting these insights? The question had hung in the air like a challenge. I'd felt David tense beside me, undoubtedly worried about what I might reveal. Patricia had been watching me with sharp attention, as if sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite sure what it was. I read, I'd said simply. Industrial publications, market analyses, case studies. It's surprising how much you can learn when you're genuinely interested in understanding something rather than just accepting conventional wisdom. The dismissiveness in my tone hadn't been lost on anyone in the room. Richard Mitchell had cleared his throat, clearly displeased with the direction of the conversation. Sarah, I think you may be oversimplifying some complex market dynamics. Real estate development requires hands-on experience, relationships with contractors and suppliers, understanding of financing structures that goes well beyond academic reading. You're absolutely right, I'd agreed, standing up from the table. It does require all of those things, which is exactly why I've been developing them. The silence that had followed my statement had been profound. I'd looked around the room at faces reflecting confusion, concern, and dawning realization that something they thought they understood completely was actually quite different from what they'd assumed. David had broken the silence first. Sarah, what exactly are you saying? For a moment, I'd considered backing down, offering some explanation that would smooth over the tension and allow everyone to pretend this conversation had never happened. But years of hiding my achievements, of accepting condescension from people who understood less about real estate than I'd forgotten, of being treated like an ornamental addition to conversations about subjects where I had genuine expertise, had been building to this moment. I'm saying that while you've all been assuming I spend my days shopping and decorating, I've been building a real estate portfolio. I own 3 properties in Hartford worth more than $2 million. I've completed 1 major renovation project, and I'm in the middle of 2 others. And I've done it without using the Mitchell name, relying on my own judgment and the relationships I've built based on my actual capabilities. The explosion of voices that had followed my announcement had been immediate and chaotic. Patricia's horrified, "What have you done?" had mixed with David's shocked, "How is that possible?" and various other expressions of disbelief and dismay from around the table. But underneath the outrage and confusion, I'd seen something else. In several faces, a grudging respect for what I'd accomplished, even if they couldn't quite believe it was true. I'd stood there calmly as the storm of reactions had swirled around me, feeling more authentically myself than I had in years. The farm girl they'd dismissed as bringing nothing to the table had built something substantial entirely on her own merit. And this had been only the beginning. The aftermath of my revelation at David's birthday party had been swift and brutal. The rest of the evening had passed in a blur of heated conversations, hushed phone calls, and barely contained family drama. David had insisted we leave immediately, and the ride home had been conducted in Arctic silence. He'd spent that night in the guest room, claiming he needed space to process what I'd told him, though I suspected he needed space to figure out how to spin this development to his family's advantage. The next morning had brought Patricia to our door before David had left for work. Her usual polished composure cracked just enough to reveal the steel underneath. She'd barged into our living room like a general preparing for war, armed with a folder full of papers and an expression that could have withered flowers. "I've spent the night having my attorney research your little real estate venture," she'd announced, settling herself on our sofa as if claiming territory. "And I have some very serious concerns about what you've been doing behind this family's back." David had hovered near the doorway, clearly torn between supporting his wife and placating his mother. His indecision had spoken volumes about where his loyalties truly lay, but by that point, I'd been past caring about his approval or protection. "My business dealings are perfectly legal and entirely separate from the Mitchell family interests," I'd replied calmly, pouring myself coffee, with steady hands despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I've used my own money, my own credit, and my own expertise. There's nothing for you to be concerned about." Patricia's laugh had been sharp and humorless. "Nothing to be concerned about? You've been conducting business under your maiden name, creating potential conflicts of interest with Mitchell Realty, and making financial decisions without consulting your husband. Do you have any idea how this reflects on David's reputation?" The assumption that my success was somehow David's failure had been so predictable, I'd almost wanted to laugh. My achievements reflect on my capabilities, not on David's. The fact that you can't separate those two things says more about your perspective than about my business practices. "Your achievements," Patricia had spat, standing abruptly and beginning to pace across our carefully decorated living room. "You've taken advantage of beginner's luck and favorable market conditions to create an unsustainable bubble. Real estate development isn't a game, Sarah. It requires generations of experience, established relationships, and understanding of market subtleties that you simply cannot possess." I'd set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, meeting her, gaze directly. "You're right about one thing. Real estate development isn't a game. That's exactly why I've spent 3 years studying every aspect of it, building relationships with contractors, architects, and lenders based on mutual respect, rather than inherited connections. My projects succeed because I solve real problems, for real people, not because I have the right last name." David had finally found his voice, though it had been strained and uncertain. "Sarah, I think what Mother is trying to say is that your business activities affect the entire family. When people see Mitchell Associates competing directly with Mitchell Realty, it creates confusion in the marketplace." "I'm not a Mitchell Associate," I'd replied firmly. "I'm Sarah Johnson, real estate developer. The only connection between my work and Mitchell Realty is the one you're trying to create by suggesting I need your family's permission to pursue my own career." The conversation had deteriorated from there, with Patricia making increasingly desperate attempts to assert control over my business decisions while I'd remained steadfast in maintaining my independence. She'd threatened to have her lawyers investigate my financing for irregularities, suggested that my success must be due to insider information obtained through David, and finally resorted to emotional manipulation about family loyalty and appropriate behavior for Mitchell wives. But something fundamental had shifted in my perception of the family dynamics. Their anger wasn't really about business ethics or market competition. It was about control, about their inability to accept that someone they'd dismissed as worthless had succeeded without their guidance or approval. The farm girl they'd expected to remain grateful for their condescending inclusion had built something that threatened their sense of superiority. The weeks that followed had been a masterclass. In family power politics, Patricia had orchestrated a campaign designed to pressure me into abandoning my business ventures, using every tool at her disposal from emotional manipulation to social ostracism. Suddenly, invitations to family events had become contingent on my willingness to discuss transitioning away from inappropriate business activities. David had found himself caught between his family's expectations and his growing awareness that his wife was not who he'd thought she was. The breaking point had come when Richard Mitchell had shown up at one of my property sites, uninvited and unannounced. I'd been meeting with contractors about kitchen renovations in the Victorian mansion when I'd received a call from Maria Santos, warning me that someone had been asking questions about my projects at the city planning office. I'd found Richard standing outside the mansion that afternoon, studying the building with an expression I couldn't quite read. He'd been dressed in one of his expensive suits, looking entirely out of place among the construction equipment and building materials scattered across the property. "Impressive work," he'd said without preamble as I'd approached, his tone neutral but his eyes calculating. "I can see why the Historic Preservation Society gave you that award." The award in question had been recognition for excellence in adaptive reuse, presented at a ceremony that none of the Mitchell family had attended because I hadn't told them about it. The fact that Richard knew about it meant he'd been investigating my activities far more thoroughly than I'd realized. "Thank you," I'd replied cautiously, unsure of his purpose in being there. "I assume you didn't come here just to tour the property." Richard had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "No, I came to make you an offer. Mitchell Realty is expanding into historic renovation and adaptive reuse projects. We'd like to acquire your portfolio and bring your expertise. In-house as a division head, you'd have significant autonomy, substantial resources, and the backing of an established firm." The offer had been substantial enough to take my breath away, far more than my properties were worth based on current market values. But even as he'd outlined the details, I'd understood what he wasn't saying. This wasn't about recognizing my capabilities or wanting to incorporate my approaches into the family business. This was about bringing me under their control, making my success part of their story, rather than evidence of my independent achievements. "That's a generous offer," I'd said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling. I'm building something here that means more to me than just financial returns." Richard's expression had hardened slightly. "Sarah, you're a bright woman, but you're naive about how business works at this level. Success in real estate isn't just about good projects or smart investments. It's about relationships, reputation, and family connections. You can't sustain this level of growth without institutional support." "I've sustained it for 3 years without institutional support," I'd pointed out. "My projects succeed because I understand markets that established firms ignore, because I see opportunities where others see problems." For now," Richard had conceded. "But markets change, economic conditions shift, competitors emerge. When that happens, loan operators like yourself are the first to fail because they lack the resources and connections to weather difficult periods." His words had carried an implicit threat that hadn't been lost on me. The Mitchell family had the power to make my business life significantly more difficult if they chose to do so. Their connections with lenders, contractors, and city officials could create obstacles that would be challenging to overcome alone. But instead of intimidating me, Richard's threats had only strengthened my resolve. "Mr. Mitchell," I'd said, watching his eyes carefully, "are you suggesting that the Mitchell family would actively work to undermine my business if I refuse to sell to you?" "I'm suggesting that business success requires strategic alliances," he'd replied smoothly. "Independent operators who refuse reasonable partnership opportunities often find the marketplace less welcoming than they'd expected." That evening, I'd called an emergency meeting with Maria Santos and Amy Rodriguez at my Hartford office. The space I'd rented above a coffee shop had served its purpose during the early phases of my business development, but I'd been considering upgrading to something more substantial. Richard's visit had convinced me that it was time to make several significant changes to how I conducted my business. "They're trying to force you into their orbit," Maria had said after I'd described my conversation with Richard. "The Mitchells built their business on controlling relationships and markets. Having a successful competitor who operates outside their influence threatens their entire model." Amy had been more direct in her assessment. "They're scared of you," she'd said, bluntly. "You've proven that their ways of doing business aren't the only ways, or even the best ways. That undermines everything they've told themselves about why they deserve their position." We'd spent hours that night developing a strategy for protecting my business from potential interference. Maria had recommended incorporating under a more formal business structure that would provide additional legal protections. Amy had suggested expanding my professional network to include people outside Connecticut's traditional real estate establishment. I'd begun researching opportunities to take my business regional, reducing my dependence on local relationships that the Mitchells might influence. But the most important decision I'd made that night had been personal rather than professional. I'd finally acknowledged what I'd been avoiding for months. My marriage to David was built on foundations that no longer existed. The woman he'd married had been someone trying desperately to fit into his family's definition of appropriate behavior. The woman I'd become had built her own definition of success and worth, one that didn't require anyone's approval or permission. The conversation I'd had with David 3 days later had been years in the making. I'd found him in our home office, supposedly working but actually staring out the window with the distracted expression he'd worn increasingly often since his birthday party. "David," I'd said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "we need to talk about our marriage." He'd looked up with something like relief in his eyes, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to name what we'd both been avoiding. "I don't know who you are anymore," he'd said quietly. "The woman I married wanted the same things I wanted. She was happy to be part of this family, part of this life. The woman you married was trying very hard to become someone she wasn't," I'd replied gently. "I spent 2 years attempting to shrink myself into a shape that would fit your family's expectations. But that's not sustainable, David. I can't keep pretending to be less than I am." David had been quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over and over in his hands. "I admire what you've accomplished," he'd said eventually. "But I don't understand why you had to hide it from me. Why couldn't we build something together?" The question had hit me harder than I'd expected because it touched on the sadness I'd been carrying about our relationship. "Because your family made it clear that my participation in real estate would be seen as competition rather than collaboration. Because you chose their approval over supporting my ambitions. Because you needed a wife who enhanced your image rather than someone who had her own independent success." The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly civil, though I suspected Patricia had been advocating for a more combative approach behind the scenes. David had seemed almost relieved to be freed from the tension that had consumed our relationship for the past year. We'd both recognized that we'd grown into people who wanted fundamentally different things from life. The property settlement had been straightforward since I'd maintained complete financial independence throughout our marriage. My business assets remained mine, our shared marital property was divided equitably, and I'd walked away from any claim to Mitchell family wealth or assets. I'd wanted nothing from them except the freedom to pursue my own path without interference. The irony hadn't been lost on me that the divorce had been finalized just as my business had reached a new level of success. The Victorian mansion renovation had been featured in architectural magazines, leading to new consulting opportunities and investment proposals. I'd expanded my team to include a full-time project manager and 2 junior associates, moving into a professional office space in downtown Hartford that reflected my growing ambitions. More importantly, I'd begun receiving recognition within Connecticut's real estate development community for my innovative approaches to historic preservation and sustainable design. Awards and speaking engagements had followed, establishing my reputation as someone who could see potential where others saw problems, which was how, 5 years after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I'd found myself sitting in my corner office on the 20th floor of a Hartford high-rise I now owned, looking across my desk at Richard Mitchell as he shifted uncomfortably in the chair I'd gestured him toward. "Mr. Mitchell," I'd said, keeping my voice professionally neutral despite the surge of satisfaction I'd felt. "Thank you for coming. I understand you're interested in discussing a potential investment opportunity." Richard had aged in the years since I'd last seen him at close range. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. He'd arrived at my office alone, without the retinue of advisors and assistants who usually accompanied Mitchell family business meetings. "Ms. Johnson," he'd replied, using my maiden name with careful emphasis, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. As you may have heard, Mitchell Realty Group is facing some financial challenges that require innovative solutions." I'd heard, of course. The real estate market had shifted dramatically in recent years, with traditional approaches to development and sales struggling to adapt to changing buyer preferences and economic conditions. Firms that had relied on established relationships and conventional wisdom were finding themselves increasingly irrelevant in a marketplace that valued sustainability, authenticity, and social responsibility. "I'm always interested in hearing about interesting projects," I'd said, opening the folder he'd brought with him. The documents inside had told a story of declining revenues, client defections, and mounting debt obligations. Mitchell Realty Group, the firm that had once seemed so powerful and untouchable, was on the verge of bankruptcy. "We're looking for a strategic investor," Richard had continued, his voice carefully controlled despite what this conversation must have cost him personally. "Someone with experience in adaptive reuse and sustainable development who could help guide the company through a necessary transformation." I'd studied the financial statements more carefully, noting the specific properties that were dragging down the firm's portfolios. Several were buildings I'd looked at over the years, but had passed on because they didn't fit my criteria for profitable renovation. Mitchell Realty had acquired them during more optimistic times and had been unable to find buyers willing to invest in traditional development approaches. "These are significant challenges," I'd observed after reviewing the materials. "The properties in your portfolio require substantial capital investment and expertise in areas where Mitchell Realty has limited experience. The financial restructuring alone would be complex and time-consuming." Richard had nodded grimly. "Which is why we need someone with your particular skill set. Your track record with difficult properties and complex renovations makes you an ideal partner for this type of project." The irony had been so perfect I'd almost laughed out loud. The man who had once threatened to use his influence to undermine my business was now sitting in my office asking for my help to save his. The family that had dismissed me as a farm girl playing dress-up was now seeking investment from the company I'd built through the very approaches they'd ridiculed. "Mr. Mitchell," I'd said, setting down the financial documents and meeting his gaze directly. "Are you aware that the building we're sitting in is one of my properties? That Johnson Development Group owns more Class A office space in Hartford than Mitchell Realty has ever managed?" I'd watched the color drain from his face as he'd processed what I was telling him. The meeting wasn't taking place on neutral ground, or even in his territory. He was asking for help while sitting in a building I owned, surrounded by evidence of the success he'd claimed was unsustainable. "I had heard rumors," he'd admitted quietly, "but I hadn't realized the extent of your holdings." "Most people don't," I'd replied. "I've built my business by focusing on results rather than publicity. But Johnson Development Group now employs over 30 people and manages properties worth more than $50 million. We've completed 12 major renovation projects in the past 3 years, with occupancy rates consistently above 95%. Richard had been quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he'd looked up again, there had been something different in his expression. Not quite humility, but an acknowledgement of reality he'd been avoiding. "I underestimated you," he'd said simply. "We all did. I assumed that your early success was luck, that market conditions would eventually reveal your inexperience. I was wrong." "Yes," I'd agreed. "You were." He'd cleared his throat, seeming to gather himself for what came next. "Sarah, I know there's personal history between our families that complicates this situation. I know the way we treated you was unfair, particularly during your marriage to David, but I'm hoping we can set that aside and consider this as a business proposition." I'd leaned back in my chair, considering his words. The request for investment was genuine. Mitchell Realty really was in serious financial trouble. The properties in their portfolio represented exactly the kind of challenges I'd built my expertise around solving. From a purely business perspective, acquiring their assets at distressed prices could be extremely profitable. But there was more than business involved here. This was the moment I'd unconsciously been working toward for 5 years. The vindication of every choice I'd made since walking away from the life they'd planned for me. The farm girl they'd thought brought nothing to the table was now in a position to determine the fate of their family legacy. "Mr. Mitchell," I'd said, opening my laptop and pulling up a presentation I'd prepared after receiving his initial call. I am interested in your proposal, but with specific conditions. I'd spent the next hour outlining my terms for acquiring Mitchell Realty Group's distressed properties and providing the strategic guidance they'd requested. The financial aspects were fair but firm. I would purchase the troubled assets at market value, provide management expertise for the renovation projects, and offer consulting services for the broader business transformation. But my personal terms had been equally important. The acquisition would be conducted publicly, with full disclosure of my role and the reasons for Mitchell Realty's need for outside investment. There would be no attempts to frame our collaboration as a merger of equals or to downplay my controlling position in the arrangement. The narrative would be clear. Johnson Development Group was rescuing Mitchell Realty Group from the consequences of their inability to adapt to changing market conditions. These terms are quite specific about public messaging, Richard had observed, reading through my proposal. Are you concerned about how this arrangement will be perceived? I want it to be clear that this is a business decision based on my company's capabilities and your company's needs, I'd replied. No spin, no face-saving narratives, no attempts to minimize the reality of the situation. Richard had been quiet for several minutes, reviewing the documents and undoubtedly calculating the personal cost of accepting my terms. Finally, he'd set down the papers and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You have every right to be vindictive about this, he'd said. My family treated you badly, and now we're asking for your help when we're vulnerable. The fact that you're willing to consider this proposal at all shows more grace than we probably deserve. This isn't about vindication, I'd said, though that wasn't entirely true. It's about building something sustainable and valuable. Your properties have potential that traditional approaches haven't unlocked. I can provide the expertise and resources to realize that potential. We'd shaken hands on the basic terms that afternoon, with the understanding that formal contracts would be developed over the following weeks. As Richard had gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he'd paused at my office door. Sarah, he'd said, using my first name for perhaps the second time in all the years I'd known him, I owe you an apology. Not just for today's situation, but for how we treated you when you were part of our family. You deserved better than the dismissal and condescension you received. Yes, I'd agreed simply. I did. After he'd left, I'd stood at my office windows looking out over the Hartford skyline, much of which I now owned or controlled through my various business interests. The city spread below me like a map of opportunities realized and challenges overcome, each building representing someone's vision made tangible through determination and hard work. My phone had buzzed with a text from Amy, who was now a partner in my company and one of my closest advisors. How did it go with the Mitchell patriarch? She'd asked. I'd smiled as I'd typed my response. The farm girl just bought the manor. The real irony, I'd realized, wasn't that the Mitchell family had needed my help. It was that they'd never understood what they were really fighting against. They'd seen my success as a threat to their established order, a challenge to the way things had always been done, but I'd never been trying to prove them wrong or to diminish their achievements. I'd simply been trying to prove myself right, to demonstrate that worth wasn't inherited or granted by others, but created through vision, effort, and the courage to pursue your own definition of success. The Mitchell family had built their identity around being the arbiters of appropriate behavior and business practices. But times had changed, and their certainties had become limitations. Standing in my office that evening, I'd thought about the woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving table 8 years earlier, absorbing Patricia's cruel assessment of her worth. That woman had believed somewhere deep inside that maybe the Mitchell family was right. Maybe she was just a farm girl playing dress-up, pretending to be something she wasn't. But I knew better now. I'd never been pretending to be something I wasn't. I'd been trying to be less than what I was, diminishing myself to fit into spaces designed for smaller ambitions. The real revelation hadn't been proving the Mitchell family wrong about my capabilities. It had been discovering that my capabilities were far greater than even I had imagined. The farm girl who had been dismissed as worthless had built an empire that would outlast the family that had rejected her. And tomorrow, there would be new properties to develop, new challenges to solve, and new opportunities to create value, where others saw only problems. That, I'd realized, was worth more than all the Thanksgiving dinners in Connecticut. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 8 years after that first disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. I was reviewing architectural plans for a waterfront development project when Maria Santos called, her voice carrying an excitement I rarely heard from my usually composed attorney. "Sarah, you need to see today's Hartford Business Journal," she said without preamble. "The Mitchell story is front-page news." I pulled up the digital edition on my laptop, and there it was. A photo of Richard Mitchell looking haggard outside the Mitchell Realty Group offices, with the headline, "Local Development Firm Saves Historic Real Estate Company from Bankruptcy." The article detailed Johnson Development Group's acquisition of Mitchell Realty's distressed properties and my appointment as interim CEO to oversee their business transformation. But what caught my attention wasn't the business coverage. It was the sidebar story titled, "From Dismissed Wife to Industry Leader, the Sarah Johnson Story." The journalist had clearly done extensive research, tracing my journey from small-town Iowa through my brief marriage to David Mitchell and subsequent rise in Connecticut real estate. The piece included quotes from clients, competitors, and industry experts who painted a picture of someone who had revolutionized local approaches to sustainable development and historic preservation. Most importantly, the article included a statement from Patricia Mitchell that she'd clearly been pressured to provide. Ms. Johnson has demonstrated exceptional business acumen and vision. We're grateful for her expertise during this challenging transition period. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. After years of keeping my achievements quiet, operating under my maiden name to avoid family complications, my success was now public knowledge. The Connecticut real estate community would finally understand who had been behind some of their most admired projects. My phone rang constantly that day. Reporters wanting interviews, potential clients interested in my services, former colleagues expressing congratulations or surprise at the scope of what I'd built. But the call I'd been expecting came late in the afternoon from a number I recognized as David's. "Sarah," he said when I answered, his voice carrying a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. "I saw the news coverage. I wanted to call and say congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone neutral despite the complexity of speaking with my ex-husband about business success that had developed during our marriage. "I also wanted to apologize," he continued after a pause. "I've had a lot of time to think about our marriage, about the way my family treated you, about the things I should have said or done differently." I waited for him to continue, not sure what response he was looking for or what response I was prepared to give. "You tried to tell me who you were," he said quietly. "You tried to show me your capabilities, your ambitions, your vision for what you could build. And I dismissed it because it didn't fit the version of you that was convenient for my family. You weren't ready to see me as anything other than what your family expected," I said gently. David had been as much a victim of their narrow worldview as I had been, though he'd chosen compliance while I'd chosen rebellion. "I should have defended you," he said. "I should have recognized that you were trying to build something meaningful, instead of just playing house the way Mother expected. I should have been proud of your achievements instead of threatened by them." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as David shared his perspective on our marriage and its aftermath. He'd spent years in therapy, he told me, working through the conditioning that had made him value family approval over personal integrity. He'd eventually left Mitchell Realty to start his own firm focused on sustainable residential development. inspired in part by approaches I'd pioneered. "I know it's too late for us," he said as our conversation wound down. "But I hope you know that I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished. You've built something remarkable, and you've done it entirely on your own terms." After we'd hung up, I sat quietly in my office as the Hartford skyline settled into evening shadows. David's apology had been sincere, but it also underscored how completely our lives had diverged. The woman he'd married had been someone still figuring out who she wanted to become. The woman I'd become had no need for validation from someone who had required 8 years to recognize her worth. The real test of my new public profile came 2 weeks later at the annual Connecticut Real Estate Development Association conference. I'd been invited to deliver the keynote address on sustainable development practices, marking the first time the organization had featured a female speaker in its 50-year history. Standing at the podium looking out over an audience of hundreds of developers, investors, and industry professionals, I felt the weight of how far I'd traveled from that first Thanksgiving dinner. Many of these people had worked with Mitchell Realty over the years and had undoubtedly heard Patricia's dismissive comments about David's inappropriate wife who didn't understand business realities. Now they were here to listen to my insights on market trends and development strategies. 8 years ago, I began, watching faces in the audience as recognition dawned for some who remembered the Mitchell family dynamics. I was told that real estate development required generations of experience, established relationships, and understanding of market subtleties that outsiders simply couldn't possess. A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed my opening, clearly wondering where this was heading. "The person who told me this wasn't wrong about the challenges," I continued. "Real estate development is complex, demanding, and unforgiving of mistakes. But they were wrong about who gets to succeed in this industry and how that success gets built." I spent the next 45 minutes describing my approach to development, identifying undervalued properties, solving complex renovation challenges, and creating value through innovation rather than relying on inherited advantages. I talked about the importance of understanding changing demographics, environmental concerns, and social responsibilities that traditional developers had overlooked. But more than specific strategies, I talked about perspective, about how being an outsider had allowed me to see opportunities that insiders missed because they were too invested in existing systems, about how being dismissed and underestimated had freed me to pursue approaches that established firms considered too risky or unconventional. The real estate industry, like many traditional industries, has often operated on assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't, whose perspectives matter and whose don't, I said as my speech neared its conclusion. But markets don't care about pedigree or social connections. Markets care about solutions to real problems, value creation, and meeting actual demand. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but the conversations during the cocktail reception that followed were even more meaningful. Developer. After developer approached me to discuss potential collaborations, sharing their own stories of struggling against industry orthodoxies and exclusionary practices, an older woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who'd been trying to break into commercial development for decades, pulled me aside near the end of the evening. "You don't know how important this speech was," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "I've been fighting to be taken seriously in this industry for 30 years. Seeing you up there, talking about your success without apologizing for it, gives me hope that things really are changing." As I drove home that night, I realized that my story had become bigger than personal vindication or business success. By refusing to accept the Mitchell family's assessment of my limitations, by building something substantial through my own efforts, I demonstrated that worth couldn't be inherited or granted by others. It had to be created and claimed. The months that followed brought new challenges and opportunities as I worked to transform Mitchell Realty into a modern development firm. The process required laying off longtime employees whose approaches were incompatible with contemporary market demands, updating technology systems that were decades behind industry standards, and fundamentally changing a corporate culture built around exclusivity and tradition. Patricia Mitchell had been the most difficult aspect of the transition. Though no longer involved in day-to-day operations, she'd retained an office at company headquarters and had continued to treat the firm as her personal domain. Our interactions had been stilted and formal, both of us navigating the complex dynamics of past history and present necessity. The breakthrough in our relationship had come during a project review meeting where we'd been discussing plans for developing one of the properties I'd acquired from the Mitchell portfolio. Patricia had been sitting quietly in the corner, occasionally making notes, but mostly observing as I'd led the discussion with architects and contractors. This approach to preserving the building's historical character while modernizing its systems, she'd said during a pause in the conversation. It's quite sophisticated, much more nuanced than I initially understood. After the meeting had ended and others had left, Patricia had remained behind. "Sarah," she'd said, using my first name for the first time in years, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that I was fundamentally wrong about who you are and what you're capable of." I'd waited for her to continue, surprised by the uncharacteristic vulnerability in her voice. I spent so many years believing that success in business came from protecting established advantages, from maintaining barriers that kept out people who might threaten existing power structures, she'd continued. I saw you as a threat because you represented change, because you approached things differently than we'd always done them. You saw me as someone who didn't belong because I didn't fit your definitions of appropriate background or behavior. I'd said gently but firmly. Yes, she'd agreed. And I was wrong. You didn't need to fit our definitions because you were creating your own. You weren't trying to join our world. You were building a better one. That conversation had marked a turning point in our professional relationship, though our personal history remained complex. Patricia had become one of my most effective advocates in certain social circles, helping to ease the transition as Mitchell Realty clients adapted to new management and approaches. The transformation of Mitchell Realty had taken 18 months, but the results had exceeded even my optimistic projections. By focusing on sustainable development, adaptive reuse of historic properties, and serving market segments that traditional firms had ignored, we'd not only restored the company to profitability, but had positioned it as an industry leader in innovative development practices. The personal satisfaction of this success had been profound, but what had meant even more to me were the systemic changes that had resulted. Other development firms had begun adopting similar approaches, recognizing that environmental consciousness and social responsibility weren't just ethical imperatives but competitive advantages. Young professionals entering the industry had started seeking out companies that prioritized innovation over tradition, creating pressure for broader cultural shifts. I'd also established a mentorship program connecting experienced female developers with women trying to enter the industry. The program had grown from a small networking group to a formal organization with chapters in several cities, providing resources and support for people who faced the same exclusionary attitudes I'd encountered. Standing in my office 5 years after the acquisition of Mitchell Realty, now rebranded as Sustainable Development Partners, I'd reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner, where Patricia had dismissed me as worthless. The farm girl from Iowa had built one of Connecticut's most successful development firms, had been recognized as an industry leader, and had helped create opportunities for others who'd faced similar challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful change hadn't been in external recognition or financial success. It had been in my understanding of my own worth. I no longer needed anyone's approval to know that my contributions were valuable, my perspectives were valid, and my achievements were legitimate. The knock on my office door had interrupted my contemplation. Amy Rodriguez had entered carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the broad smile she reserved for particularly good news. The Hartford project just got final approval, she'd announced, setting the champagne on my desk. All environmental permits cleared. Historic Preservation Society approval confirmed, and the investor group is officially committed. The Hartford project was our most ambitious undertaking yet, converting an entire abandoned industrial district into a mixed-use community that would provide affordable housing, creative workspace, and commercial facilities while preserving the area's architectural heritage. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-stakeholder development that I'd dreamed about during those early years, when I'd been told my ideas were too idealistic for the real world. As Amy had opened the champagne and poured 2 glasses, I'd thought about all the people who had bet against me over the years. The college advisor who'd suggested I focus on more practical career options. The Mitchell family who'd seen me as a decorative addition rather than a capable partner. The industry veterans who'd dismissed my approaches as naive enthusiasm. They hadn't been entirely wrong about the challenges I'd face or the obstacles I'd need to overcome. But they'd been completely wrong about my capacity to meet those challenges, to learn from setbacks, and to build something substantial through determination and vision. "You know what I realized?" Amy had said as we'd toasted the project approval. "You never actually needed to prove anything to the Mitchell family or anyone else. You just needed to prove it to yourself." She'd been right, of course. The farm girl who'd sat at that Thanksgiving table hadn't needed validation from people who couldn't see past their own prejudices and limitations. She'd needed the confidence to trust her own judgment, the courage to pursue her own vision, and the persistence to build something meaningful despite others' doubts. Now, as I prepared to leave the office that evening, I'd looked forward to going home to the restored Victorian mansion I'd purchased 2 years earlier. It was a house that reflected my own story, something with good bones that had been overlooked and undervalued, transformed through vision and effort into something beautiful and valuable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to create value through innovation and hard work. There would be properties to develop, teams to lead, and barriers to overcome. But tonight, I'd planned to have dinner on my back porch, overlooking the garden I'd planted with vegetables and herbs my father had taught me to grow, connecting me to my roots while celebrating how far I'd traveled. The farm girl from Iowa had indeed learned to play dress-up, but not in the way Patricia Mitchell had meant. I'd learned to dress up challenges as opportunities, obstacles as advantages, and dismissals as motivation. Most importantly, I'd learned that worth wasn't something others granted or withheld. It was something you created through the choices you made and the values you lived by. As I'd driven through the Connecticut countryside toward home that evening, past properties I'd developed and communities I'd helped create, I'd smiled thinking about that long-ago Thanksgiving dinner. Patricia Mitchell had been wrong about almost everything regarding my worth and potential, but she'd been right about one thing: I'd never be more than a farm girl. I'd simply learned that being a farm girl meant understanding hard work, seeing potential in overlooked places, and knowing that the most valuable things in life were those you built with your own hands and your own vision. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.